So with that, I'm going to dive in, and the outline for today and what we're going to cover. The first part is going to be a presentation where I am going to provide a summary of the discussions that we had at the workshop. A lot of the people on the call today were participants in that workshop, but there were some folks who could not attend. So this is intended to provide a summary and get people caught up to, a little bit caught up to speed on what we covered during that workshop if you were not able to attend. But I think it's also going to be a useful summary for folks who were at the meeting, partly because June is now sort of long ago in the past for many of us, and our memories may need some prompting, but also because we had a number of different breakout groups and not a lot of time for sharing across those breakout groups. So hopefully I'll be able to provide, again, a little bit of a synthesis of the range of content that was covered in all the different breakout groups during that meeting. After providing the workshop summary, which will probably take me about 30 minutes, we will then have some time to have a group discussion about where we might go to build off of the foundation that was laid during that workshop. And so I sort of call that the discussion about next steps for this project. And then we'll have time for a discussion about next steps for what we're calling the Rocky Mountain Partner Forum, which is a construct of the Great Northern LCC. And so let me just say a couple quick words about how I'm distinguishing between this project and the Rocky Mountain Partner Forum. This project is a project that has been put together by myself, Gary Tabor at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, Laura Hansen at EcoAdapt, and Nina Chambers, who's an independent consultant and also a fellow with the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. And the goal of the project is that we are intending to lead is to help facilitate collaborative landscape scale climate change planning among diverse partnerships and organizations in the Rocky Mountains, loosely ecoregion of the Great Northern LCC area. So this is a project that is funded by the Great Northern LCC, and part of their interest in supporting this work is they saw it as an opportunity to help initiate what they call a Rocky Mountain Partner Forum. At the end of this webinar, Nina Chambers is going to say a lot more about the Great Northern LCC and what they intend for these partner forums to look like and do and contribute to the larger landscape conservation cooperative concept. So I'm not going to spend a lot more time talking about that here, but suffice it to say that this project is a specific project. It's targeted specifically at talking about large landscape scale climate change issues. And as of now, it is sort of the first and currently only project that is trying to kind of help jumpstart the creation of this partner forum. So again, the first sort of 2/3 of this webinar, we're going to be focused on this project and the workshop that was one of the primary activities in our first year, and then have some discussion about what we might do in the second year. We recently received continued funding from the Great Northern LCC to help run this project for a second year, and we're looking to you all to help us identify what kinds of activities and would help to add value to your efforts to think about climate change at a large landscape scale in the Rocky Mountain region. And then the last part of the webinar, roughly the last half hour, we will transition to having a broader discussion about what the Rocky Mountain Partner Forum could look like and who might want to be involved and what kinds of activities the forum might try and tackle. So with that, just again, quickly focusing again on this project. And again, we are finishing our first year of this effort, and it included a number of different activities over this past year. A webinar where we were sharing with you all various resources for climate change planning that are available to support your work. We talked about different case studies. We then worked together to identify a single focal resource to start with, and we chose cold water systems, including cold water species, as well as hydrological flows, as well as riparian areas and broader watershed functioning in these cold water systems. As the focus for what I'm going to talk about here today, an in-person climate change planning workshop that we held this past June where we collectively assessed the vulnerability of cold water systems in the region and talked about potential strategies for reducing those vulnerabilities. So again, this is what I'm going to be focusing on in my summary, is this workshop. The goals of the workshop, we had 3 main goals. The first was to learn about how to incorporate climate change information into conservation and management, and to sort of learn how to do it by doing it, by actually talking about the impacts of climate change and potential management options for dealing with cold water systems at a large landscape scale. So the second goal was to actually talk about the impacts and come up with potential management strategies for conserving cold water systems as climate changes. And then the third goal was to help to build and strengthen a climate change practitioners network across this region, and to help connect people and share stories and lessons learned and build this network of practitioners. The structure of the workshop, we had sort of 3 main types of activities during the meeting. We had a small number of presentations where we had experts on particular topics presenting to the audience on some information. We had some time where we had some structured sharing of examples of how among the people there assembled in the room are beginning to bring climate change information into their conservation work. And then lastly, we spent a lot of time in breakout groups doing an interactive planning exercise where we worked together with scientists as well as managers and practitioners, worked together to talk about the impacts of climate change on cold water systems. So those were and so I'll structure the summary in the rest of this presentation, providing a little bit of a summary of each of these 3 types of activities, focusing mostly on the interactive planning. So starting with the presentations, I am not going to go into any of the details of what material was covered during these presentations, just a sense of the types of topics we covered. Most of the presentations are available for download on the workshop support page, which I will show up at the bottom of the screen when I get to the bottom of this slide. And so you can go and check out those presentations and learn more about what was covered. The first presentation was Laura and myself talking about some climate change planning 101 and just some of the basics of what to think about when bringing climate change into conservation and natural resource management. We had Greg Peterson of USGS talk about historic weather and climate trends and expectations of future change in this region. Robert Alchokachi, also from USGS, then talked about the implications of climate change for aquatic systems and how we can improve our understanding of the effects of climate change to help direct management strategies. And then lastly, we had Ray Rasker from Headwaters Economics talk about some of the sort of background changes that are ongoing across this landscape that are going to interact with climate change, and in particular, current socioeconomic and demographic trends and how those may respond to climate change. Now, Ray Rasker's was the only one that was not a PowerPoint presentation, so while the others are available at this website that I'm showing now on the screen, Ray Rasker instead just provided some demonstrations of some tools, interactive tools that are available on the Headwaters Economics website. So you can't download his presentation, but you can check out their website and learn more about the information they have available on socioeconomic and demographic data and how it might relate to climate change. So again, the presentations are available online. The written workshop report, which we will be sharing with you all very soon, will also provide a couple of summary points from each of these presentations. So again, the second type of activity we had during the workshop was sort of peer-to-peer sharing of examples from the region. And we had 6 different folks that we asked to give little mini presentations to start this session. And we tried to provide a few examples that spread across the geography of the Rocky Mountain portion of the Great Northern LCC. And so you can see those examples here. And again, I'm not going to provide any details right now, but the workshop report will provide a short summary of each of these examples. You can see the mini presentations also available for download at the workshop website. And after we had these 6 examples, we opened it up to the floor of anyone in the room who had some other examples, and we gathered quite a number of other examples of ways that people are bringing climate change information into their work from around this region and for a variety of different kinds of species and ecosystem targets. And so again, the workshop report will have some very brief summaries of some of those examples, and Laura Hansen and her colleagues at EcoAdapt are also preparing some longer case study descriptions of at least the 6 that are starred on the map that will be available online through their website, cakex.org. That's sorry, I should have put it up on the screen, cakex.org. So, and then, as I said, a lot of the time was spent doing interactive planning exercises where we had scientists, managers, and practitioners working together to think about, well, what are our current goals and actions as they relate to cold water systems? How might climate change affect our ability to achieve those goals and the effectiveness of those actions? And then lastly, whether and how we might need to adjust our goals and actions to accommodate the impacts of climate change or be better prepared for the impacts of climate change. So these are sort of the 3 phases of what we covered during the planning exercise. So I'll start by talking about the discussions related to current goals. Each breakout group, there were 3 different breakout groups. We allowed them to sort of decide amongst themselves which goal or goals, plural, they wanted to cover during their time. And so each breakout group covered some slightly different topics, although really there was quite a bit of overlap across them. And so some groups took a little bit more of a species-based focus and talked a lot about native fish and other native aquatic species. Other groups are at different times. People talked more about hydrological flows as they then might benefit both wildlife, but also fish and wildlife, but also human communities. And then there were times when groups were focused on even bigger picture kinds of goals related to aquatic and terrestrial ecological integrity. And so while, again, each group had a slightly different focus, there was quite a bit of overlap. And what we realized through our discussions is that these are not fundamentally separate goals, but in fact could probably be depicted in this sort of nested manner, where if you care about fish, you're also going to care about flows and ecological and aquatic and terrestrial integrity and connectivity. But there could be other aspects of flows that we care about that aren't just about native fish. For example, like I mentioned, some groups talked a little bit about the provision of clean water for human communities as well as a goal. So when we kind of looked collectively at the range of goals considered, I think it's safe to say we covered quite a broad territory, but also this kind of nested territory of different goals. We also realized that we did a pretty good job of aligning the conversations with the Great Northern LCC Strategic Conservation Framework, which if you have access to it, on page 9 lists 4 major goals. One of which, goal number 3, is about maintaining hydrologic regimes that support native or desirable aquatic plant and animal communities in still and moving waters. There also is a goal related to connectivity, and that I think also we touched upon during these conversations. So I think it's fairly safe to say that the content of our discussions at this workshop, while we didn't sort of approach it from a top-down perspective of we are going to examine this GNLCC strategic framework goal, I think all of the content of our discussions is very applicable to thinking about how we might be able to achieve that goal as climate changes. So again, that's just to give a sense for the goals that we were considering during our conversation. And then we needed to move into the phase of assessing, well, how might climate change impact our ability to achieve those goals? What kinds of vulnerabilities are the targets that we care about facing? And we provided a number of different resources to try and help spur the conversation about impacts and vulnerabilities. We had a graphical conceptual model depicted here that helped highlight some of the key interactions between climate and the cold water aspects of cold water systems that we care about on the far right in those blue boxes, and some of the different pathways through which a change in climate could influence those cold water systems. We also provide a summary table of some of the expected climate-related changes in the Northern Rockies, historical changes, predicted future changes, and some issues related to uncertainty and our level of confidence about those changes. And then we asked some of these science experts ahead of time to share some information on what they see as being some of the key impacts and vulnerabilities. And so we provided a worksheet, we called it a cheat sheet, just a starting point for some of the impacts that some of the science experts highlighted as being important in this region for cold water systems. So that helped to spur some of the conversation. And then, of course, we had the presentations in the morning that provided information for the conversation. And then we had both scientists and managers in the room during the discussions so the collective knowledge of that system was also represented in our discussion. So I'm not going to have time right now to exhaustively discuss the range of impacts and vulnerabilities that we talked about at the meeting. Those will be more thoroughly documented in the written workshop report. But I did want to provide just a couple examples of the kinds of things we discussed, some particular impacts that came up probably in every breakout session and are clearly very important to thinking about how we need to think about our goals and our actions. So the first one is that it's very likely that we will see decreases in snowpack in this region, and therefore decreases in the sort of contribution that snowmelt makes to streams, and that in combination with warmer air temperatures is likely to lead to lower summer flows and warmer water temperatures. And that this can have consequences for native trout, cold water trout, since it could be that thermal tolerances for those trout are exceeded in some streams during some years or in some parts of the year, which makes it difficult to achieve our conservation goals for this species, in particular to try and maintain and restore native trout across their current, and in some cases even striving to restore them across their historic range as well. So this is an example where we can think about sort of a change in a climate variable that has an influence on the ecosystem and the species of interest that directly relates to our ability to achieve our goal of maintaining and restoring the species. Another example is that if we have warmer water temperatures and we have an altered hydrograph, and in particular the hydrograph in the early spring period in terms of the quantity of springtime flows and the timing of that peak, that those changes may end up favoring some non-native fish species and increase their distribution in abundance, which then has negative consequences for native trout and our ability to protect or restore natives in streams that are becoming invaded. So this is perhaps an example of a somewhat less direct impact where the changes in climate, well, they may have direct effects on Yellowstone cutthroat trout, for example, but in this case, they also have an impact on another species, and that a change in that non-native species could then have competitive and predatory or hybridization impacts on the native species that we care about. So this was a definite concern, especially as it related to native cold water fish species. And then the last example, moving away from a single species example, we talked about how warmer and drier conditions may lead to shifts in the structure and composition of riparian vegetation and the drying of wetlands. People specifically called out concerns related to cottonwoods and declines in cottonwoods as we have lower stream flows and there becomes more of a disconnect between the water table and the stream and the importance of those connections for cottonwoods. And so that those changes in the riparian systems and in wetland systems could have negative impacts on our ability to provide wildlife connectivity across the landscape, both aquatic and terrestrial connectivity across the landscape. So this is kind of, again, zooming out a bit and looking more at ecological integrity in this system and how changes in climate could have impacts on that ecological integrity. So just a couple examples, just to give you a flavor for the types of impacts and vulnerabilities that we were concerned about at this meeting. So in terms of thinking about that information and then circling back around to, well, are these changes in climate and in the ecological systems, how are they going to affect our ability to achieve our current conservation goals for cold water systems? And it was pretty clear that the achievability of our current goals are likely to be threatened, at least in some places and at some time, by climate change. And so we talked about the need to consider a number of factors as we think about revising our goals. And one is about spatial variability. In some places across this landscape, the changes will be very extreme. In other places, the changes may be more buffered. And so we need to think spatially about where and when certain goals may be achievable. You may not be able to achieve goals related to native cutthroat trout across their entire current range or their entire historic range, so we can maybe think carefully about places within those areas that we can try and achieve those goals, and other places where we might need to change what we're focusing on. We also talked about the need to think about time scale. We may be able to protect current systems in place for a certain amount of time, but perhaps not indefinitely, and not under certain magnitudes of warming and change. And so we need to think explicitly about over what time frame are we attempting to achieve this goal in this place. And then lastly, we might need to broaden the real focus of our goals and what endpoints we're really striving for. There may be some places where we can try and maintain native cold water trout, but there are other places where we might be able to maintain flows, but they might be too warm for native trout. And so we might need to broaden our goals and what we're striving for from, in some places, a narrow focus on species to a broader focus on ecological function, because we may have a better chance of achieving those function-related goals than we do at achieving species-specific goals when those species are expected to be fundamentally affected by climate change. So these are just some of the ways that we expect that our goals we need to really explicitly consider these different factors as we articulate what goals we're striving for over what time frame and in what places. And so we also talked about the consequences for our actions. We may need to adjust our goals. We also may need to think carefully about the actions that we're taking to achieve those goals. And so again, I think there are a number of actions for which we may have concerns that the effectiveness of those actions may be influenced by climate change, negatively influenced by climate change. And so there may be some current actions that need to be modified in order to be more effective. There may be some actions that we want to stop doing because they're ineffective or maybe have a negative effect when you factor in climate change. And there may be some new actions that we're not currently taking right now that are going to be really critically important to achieve our goals as climate changes. And so it's really important that, again, we look at the kinds of actions we're taking and think carefully about whether they need to be modified, need to be stopped, or whether there are new actions out there that aren't currently on our radar that we need to consider. So again, with this part, I don't have time to go through the very long list of types of actions that we talked about during our breakout sessions. Those, again, will be covered in the written workshop report. But I wanted to just provide a few examples to give you a flavor for how we linked from the discussion of impacts to the specific actions and what actions may be needed. And then also talk about a variety of ways that our actions might need to be adjusted in light of climate change. In some cases, what we're doing may need to be different. In other cases, it might be where we're doing them or why we're doing them that needs to change. I also want to provide a few examples of how climate-informed conservation can involve on-the-ground action at a wide range of sort of intervention points or types of actions that we take that we might think about in a climate change context, but also includes things like monitoring and assessment and research as well. Those are all critical aspects of being prepared for the impact of climate change. So I'll provide a few examples along those lines. So starting with some of the, so I'm going to link back to the impacts that I described earlier. So with this impact related to changes in the availability of suitable thermal habitat for native trout, we talked about a variety of different ways we might respond to this situation. And they can be actions that are directly related to managing fish, to managing habitats, and to managing water and flows. And so again, just a few illustrative examples. We talked about perhaps we can really have a concerted effort to look at whether there are more warm adapted strains of some of the native fish that we're trying to conserve. This kind of work is already underway, and it just maybe is a real priority to get a sense for can we actually look at the genetics of these species and target those that are better adapted to warmer conditions within a species so that we can focus on those strains for restoration. One possibility. In terms of what we might want to stop doing, we might want to think really carefully about if there are some places where we're actively putting native trout back into a stream that has a very high probability of warming past acceptable thermal limit. Perhaps it's a stream that's already at that thermal limit, and warming is going to very quickly take it beyond that thermal threshold. And so we might, again, want to stop some of the restoration work that we're doing if we have concerns about the long-term effectiveness of those actions. There may still be reason to invest in those places, but we want to do it in a transparent way and think carefully about our investment. And then perhaps instead, we should be focusing on protecting and restoring habitat and taking other kinds of on-the-ground actions in areas that are currently occupied but are expected to stay cold. So some streams just may be more sensitive to warming or more vulnerable because they don't have cold groundwater input. And so we might want to try and figure out where those places are so we can be strategic about where we focus our habitat work. Another thing we could do, which is a bit more innovative, would be to actually look at streams that are currently too cold for fish, for the fish that we're focused on. And those would not be places we would invest in today. But when we think about climate change, they may in fact be very logical places to invest. We need to make sure that it's not just a water temperature issue, but they also have suitable habitat in terms of other aspects of what's needed for these fish. But these are definitely ways that we can think more creatively about where we focus our efforts. And then with water, we can think about how we might compensate for the loss of snowpack and think about ways to store water in the ecosystem, in other parts of the ecosystem, in a way that then has returned to the stream later on in summer periods. And so we're looking at a number of examples where people are either reintroducing beaver or playing the role of beaver and installing beaver mimic dams to try and slow down the flows of water, keep the water in the system, recharge groundwater tables, foster return flows back to the streams later in summer when things get warmer and drier. Another example is a landowner in southwest Montana who's installing upland microcatchments where he's physically moving around soil and plants to try and trap some of those surface runoff flows that happen in the springtime, to slow the water down, keep more water in the system, and keep it from kind of just moving out of the system and not benefiting the plants and streams. Again, a number of different kinds of intervention points where we can think about taking actions in response to the climate change impact. Moving on to the invasive species concern, some of the examples we came up with can be categorized in a couple different categories: actions related, actions on the ground, research or modeling, and monitoring examples. And so within monitoring, we talked about how we might need to, we already looked to see which areas are becoming invaded, but we might need to kind of step up the frequency with which we do those assessments, because in fact we're seeing those invasions happening faster than we might have even expected, because the warmer temperatures and altered hydrograph are facilitating them in a way we maybe didn't originally expect. And so it's not maybe changing what we're doing, but it might change kind of how frequently we're doing those assessments. We also might want to spend some time and invest in trying to model future changes in stream flow and habitat so that we can anticipate where those future invasion hotspots are going to be and try and stay on the front edge of that wave. And then in terms of actually taking action on the ground, we may choose to implement very intensive invasive species control in those streams that we expect to be good long-term investments for the native trout. So those areas that, again, that we expect to retain suitable cold water conditions. So we're being strategic about where we take the action, and we may again decide that we really want to go all out in dealing with invasives in some areas because of the consequences they have for native trout. And then lastly, with the example about changes to riparian and wetland systems, we can think about some potential responses where we might change what we're doing, we might change where we're doing it, and we might think differently about why we're taking these actions. And so an example of changing what we do, rather than doing riparian restoration with species that are currently exist in an area or have historically existed in an area, we might want to start to use species that are better suited for future conditions. and think about bringing those species into the mix that we use when we do riparian restoration. And that's a bit of a change from what we might currently be doing. We also talked about changing where we focus the work. And again, we might want to prioritize those locations for riparian restoration, perhaps based on climate change information, other aspects of the geomorphic shape of an area, other factors that are indicators of places that are going to be important for connectivity in both the near term but also in the long term to help species move in response to climate change. And then lastly, again, we might need to broaden the why we're taking particular action. So, I think it's not at all uncommon to see wetland restoration work going on in this region, but perhaps it tends to be more narrowly focused on wildlife habitat provision, or maybe some general sense of restoring hydrological flows and natural water systems. But maybe we also need to be thinking about the role that those wetlands play, again, in providing alternative storage of water to snowpack, which is going to be declining, and thinking much more broadly about these multiple benefits that these areas provide, and in terms of their ability to buffer some of the impacts of climate change. So that was sort of a very quick run through of just a few examples of the kinds of things we talked about. Again, there were many more examples of ways that we need to think very carefully about our goals and our actions in light of climate change, again, which will be better documented and more fully documented in the workshop report, and that I think go quite a long ways in providing people with some starting points of ideas for how they might think about their management decisions in light of climate change. I consider it very much a kind of menu of things to think about, as opposed to, we did not spend time during the meeting prioritizing among them, or filtering them along any kinds of criteria about feasibility or cost or effectiveness and so on. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but I think it's a useful starting point for a menu of things that people might think about. And then the last point I wanted to make about what we covered during these interactive exercises is we also, along the way, during our discussions, identified critical science and coordination needs in order to help us better understand, fill gaps related, fill knowledge gaps about the vulnerabilities of systems, or their ability, their adaptive capacity to cope with climate change impacts. There are a lot of knowledge gaps along those lines that are pretty important to deciding what kinds of actions we might want to take. There was also a number of science and coordination needs identified that related to pulling together databases, consistent databases across the entire region, geospatial, but other kinds of databases as well. There also were several calls for a need to identify metrics for how we measure our progress towards our goals as climate changes, and a number of examples where people called out the need to encourage cross-jurisdictional coordination in science and also in implementing action. So again, each breakout group came up with a list of different science and coordination needs. We did not have time during the workshop to look closely at those lists and prioritize among those needs, but that is something that I imagine the Great Northern LCC will want to take a closer look at and perhaps integrate into their science planning effort, which is intended to help them target future investments in, they can target their funding to help address some priorities in the future. So the last slide here, before we move on to more of a discussion, is we had a final plenary discussion during the workshop where, as I mentioned, we did not necessarily rigorously go through all of the actions mentioned and prioritize them in any particular way. But we did just sort of ask participants to reflect on the things that they talked about and thought about over the course of the 2 days, and to highlight what they saw as maybe being really important opportunities for furthering our efforts to be prepared for climate change at this large landscape scale. So what were some things that they saw as maybe being important opportunities that could help us all better understand how to target our conservation efforts in light of climate change? And so a few things that came out of that discussion that I wanted to highlight here, because I think it's a starting point for our conversations about topics that this group could explore in more detail going forward in the coming year. The first was Number of times it came up, the importance of trying to identify areas that are expected to retain cold water flows for longer into the future, and that can help us then target on-the-ground action. Another topic was about developing a more holistic approach to preparing for climate change by not just engaging the public land management agencies, but also local communities, working lands, and other diverse water users to sort of talk collectively about how we prepare for the impacts of climate change. A number of calls were made, and the importance of trying to instill consistency in monitoring came up a number of times. Dan Isaac's model of crowdsourcing data collection and monitoring information, both through formal public agency networks, but also looking at the ability to use citizen science as a way to crowdsource information, were a number of ideas that people threw out there as valuable ways to instill consistent monitoring in light of climate change. We also talked about the importance of sharing case studies, successes, challenges, lessons learned, so that we can scale up the benefits of that learning, and others can benefit from that learning that others have already done. And then lastly, we kept circling back around in a number of different ways and a number of different times to the fact that it's also really important that we collectively as a world community reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That there's only so much we can adapt to, so much change that we can adapt to. If that change is of a particular magnitude, we're going to have much more major losses in a conservation sense, and we're going to have to make much bigger changes to what we're focused on and what we're doing. And so, a number of times people brought up the need to think about what we're doing also to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I think a particular way to think about this in a way that looks at the intersection between how we prepare for the impacts, which is adaptation, and how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which is mitigation, is to look at activities that help us do both, that help us prepare for the impacts of climate change while also helping to reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and that there could be some interesting strategies that bridge across adaptation and mitigation that we could look into more closely. So all of these were mentioned. We spent a little bit of time fleshing out the second bullet about this, taking a more holistic approach to preparing for climate change, but even that one we really didn't have time to delve into deeply. So all of these are topics that would need quite a bit more exploring of, well, who would need to be involved, what would be the next steps, how would this come together, and ultimately making sure, how would it affect our ability to make decisions in light of climate change. So, but they were topics that people seemed interested in at the time during the workshop, and in follow-up conversations continue to be things that people mention as being useful topics to explore further going forward. So with that sort of ends my summary of what we covered during the workshop. I wanted to now transition to having a conversation and hearing from you all some of your thoughts on where we might go to build on what was accomplished during that workshop. And so, one question for the group would be to say, it's been a couple months since we've had that meeting. People may have absorbed, thought about and digested some of the information since then. They may have other ideas on opportunities that seem like really important topics to consider exploring together as a group. And so I would welcome suggestions that people might have on additional ideas on things we could focus on related to the cold water system. But then we also want to hear from folks on what would be of greatest value and interest to folks. Do people want to go deeper on some of these topics and opportunities that were identified at the workshop as they relate to cold water systems? Or we could also go in a different direction, and we could facilitate a similar kind of initial conversation on the implications of climate change for another resource issue of shared interest to this group. Like I said, in some ways we had to twist your all's arms to focus on one thing for this first workshop, and we know there are a lot of other things people are interested in and that have climate change implications. And so we could definitely spend some of our time or all of our time moving to a different resource issue and have some conversations as a group on that topic. At this point, we are fairly open to hearing what folks here on this call and that we will follow up with through some written surveys as well with you all and others who couldn't make this call to get a sense for what you would find of greatest value. And you know, we obviously have limited amount of resources and we can't do everything, but it may be we could try and do more than one thing over the course of the coming year. It really depends on what we want to do and what it would take to accomplish those activities. But right now we're sort of open to hearing from you all about what you're most interested in. So with that, I want to open the floor to questions and comments, questions about the workshop, comments from folks who participated, reflections you all want to share, ideas on opportunities that you've thought of since the meeting, or thoughts on what we might focus on in the coming year. So please feel free to raise hands, enter in comments via the chat, and let us know what you're thinking.
Okay, we have our first question. Amy, I am unmuting you. Go ahead.
It seems like we have some really good recommendations for sort of next steps in those 3 slides that you outlined in the 3 different areas. And you know, my vote would be to go deeper and to begin to analyze what are the gaps, essentially, in actually going forward and implementing those. I think there's already some work being done. You know, for example, I think Robert Ochokiti's effort to identify means for prioritizing Yellowstone cutthroat trout restoration and action in the area, but I'd love to really look deeper and say, okay, we've identified these steps that need to be taken. What are the barriers and the opportunities for actually implementing these? So that would be sort of my vote or recommendation.
So Amy, just to kind of repeat back, just to make sure I'm kind of hearing it right, would be to say, starting with this list of things that came out of the workshop, to do a first cut look at which of these things are maybe already being tackled, and if so, in what ways, and are there gaps in the extent to which they're already being tackled, and kind of get a better sense for which ones may be already moving forward, which ones may have kind of less other work already involved, and to get a better sense for kind of what would be needed to fill those gaps going forward. Is that what I'm hearing, starting with this list here that I'm showing?
Perfect. Yes, you summarized it much better than I did.
No,
that's great.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, next question is from Constanza. Constanza, I am unmuting you as quickly as I can. It's slightly more complicated. For some reason, you don't unmute. There you go. You're unmuted.
Okay, thank you. Hi. Well, I guess my comment kind of echoes Amy. Just thinking for our sub-region in the Flathead, there's been quite a bit of research on cold water fisheries up in the headwaters of the Flathead. But certainly we need to identify the gaps of what still needs to be done, or what hasn't been done for riparian areas, and identifying, okay, what are some based on some of these issues that we identified, for instance, you know, what are the plans that we need to be adjusting riparian restoration work, just to help some of the local groups, like the ones that I work, just a coalition of groups that I work with, that just don't have the capacity to follow up on some of this ourselves. But it'd be fantastic if our focus, a lot of it is riparian restoration for a systems-based approach, so to benefit the cold water fisheries, to water quality, wildlife, bird diversity, and other things, as well as farming in primary cultural soils. So just some assistance with that. You know, we could help organize local groups to kind of help identify the gaps and priorities, but would love to see something done at the regional level to help us move forward.
So Constanza, just to clarify again, just because I do want to make sure I'm capturing these correctly and hearing them correctly. So again, well, I guess I'm sort of trying to tell if you're also suggesting a little bit of an additional bullet to add to this list. I heard a little bit about, sort of doing the gap analysis, perhaps that Amy mentioned, but then also helping to connect, especially kind of connecting the sort of science and this sort of dialogue on adaptation with local groups. I mean, is that right?
Correct, yes. So that that information is fantastic, but if we have the dialogue with the local groups, then we make sure that that information is very relevant to ongoing actions and work and will be applied.
Okay. I might suggest that is maybe not quite captured in these bullets quite yet here, which is playing some sort of role in again, connecting this bigger picture thinking with local groups.
Excellent.
Okay, the next question is from Mike Whitfield.
Hello?
Mike, you're unmuted. Yep.
Okay, well, I guess a little different perspective. I mean, I certainly see the value in all the opportunities identified in the plenary discussion, but I think there might be some value in thinking along some other lines than just cold water fisheries, and it ties into all of these when you're thinking holistic approach, monitoring, sharing lessons learned, the gamut, that there might be value in kind of broadening out the conversation a bit before we drill down, rather than just strictly focusing more narrowly on cold water fisheries. And I'm thinking connectivity and some of the landscape scale issues that reach beyond those cold water systems. I think it's maybe timely to take some of that step and then broaden the audience to take these advantage of these opportunities.
Mm-hmm. So again, just like I said, just want to make sure I'm hearing it. So sort of a vote for maybe not necessarily going right away to diving deeper on cold water systems, but actually maybe going broader, connectivity being proposed as say a resource issue of shared concern that we could examine through a climate change lens, and sort of maybe doing a little bit more of the big picture thinking, and then looking across cold water systems and connectivity to then think about where to go deeper.
That would be my thought, and part of this is when we're thinking about, this is part of the engine behind the Rocky Mountain Forum for GNLCC and all of that conversation, that if we drill down too quickly into one arena, we maybe lose a lot of participants, and I think maybe keep it a little more broadly, not losing the interest in cold water fisheries. It's a key element for all of us, but stepping back a little bit to bring other folks in first.
Okay, next question is from Aaron Sexton. And Aaron, I'm trying to unmute you, but for some reason, again. There you go. It's all yours, Aaron.
Thanks. Well, I'm going to alter my comment just a little bit based on what Michael Whitfield said. I could go either way in terms of sticking with the cold water systems and drilling down into that, or sort of staying at a broader level. And I think that Michael's arguments are good in terms of not losing the kind of rest of the Rocky Mountain Partner Forum that wouldn't be specifically interested in cold water systems and native fish. So I guess I would say that given some of the bullets that are listed under the opportunities, that we might use that lens to look at some of the other priorities of the GNLCC within the Rocky Mountain ecoregion. So for example, the identify areas expected to retain cold water flows is really just identifying refugia in the face of a changing climate over time. So maybe you stay with that concept, but not necessarily restricted to areas expected to retain cold water flows. You could take a terrestrial lens to that, or stay at a broader lens of identifying refugia across the region. Similar for the rest of those bullets. I think the ideas that we arrived at the workshop could be applied, at that broader lens and that broader scale in the region, and the same for the rest of them. You kind of have it here, the consistency and monitoring piece, but I would add to that in terms of saying, really because of the many different jurisdictions within the Rocky Mountain ecoregion, it's not really quite possible for us to sort of manage consistently across that region, but we can certainly work to our best to be working off of a common science template across that region. And I'm a bit of a broken record in those comments, I think, for those of you that hear me often, but that's another concept that I think that we could work at the greater kind of ecoregion level for a little while. So those are just a few of my thoughts.
Thanks, Erin.
Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Patrick, go ahead.
Hi. My comments are, I guess, a follow-up to the last several, in that I agree that cold water systems shouldn't be the only focus, but I'd like to talk about cold water systems in this drought year as an example of how even a focus on cold water fisheries is actually instructive in other areas. One of our projects was over near Anaconda, where we reconnected a fairly large tributary to Silverboat Creek. And the first year with consistent flows is this year, the severe drought year. And a sample of radio-tagged fish from the area in Silverboat Creek, when water temperatures got high and water quality declined, all the fish traveled into this tributary, along with, and these were cutthroat trout, along with a bunch of other native fishes and a lot of bears and predatory or piscivorous birds. So although our focus might be too heavily swayed toward cold water fish, I think the bigger picture is that connectivity is important across the ecosystem, and connectivity in stream flows is very important to wildlife corridors as well. A good example is a severely dewatered stream in the Madison drainage, where it's a key migratory corridor between the Gravelly Range and the Madison Range. But because it's a dewatered stream, the riparian is poorly developed, and it creates a physical barrier to not just fisheries movement, but also large wildlife as well. So I guess my point is that the concepts of climate change adaptation strategies are all fundamentally based around the resilience of species to adapt, and for us humans providing as much room for species to adapt as possible and staying out of the way as much as possible. And one form of doing that, I think, is focusing on connectivity and hydrologic systems and how that plays into terrestrial ecosystems as well.
Thanks, Pat. Good point.
Anyone else?
So, obviously, please do continue to raise hands or submit questions. I was just going to, again, kind of reiterate what our plans are, for the process going forward here. And we are planning to follow up more thoroughly with everybody via some written surveys to take a bit more of the pulse on which way people want to go. We know from a handful of conversations that we've already had with a handful of you that we will likely find quite a diverse spread of, I want to go deeper on cold water systems. I want to go, I don't want to go on cold water systems. I want to move to something else. And people who are kind of like, I'm fine either way. So, we may not come up with a single activity that everybody's really interested in, but we are, again, looking to target our efforts in the coming year towards activities that will be of the greatest value to the most number of people that have been participating. And, we'll continue to sort out how many of these different possible ways forward we can accommodate. It certainly isn't unrealistic to think that we could do some aspects of kind of gap analysis and digging a little deeper on these cold water system issues, while perhaps also facilitating a broader discussion about some other resources of interest. So we will definitely sort out what you're all interested in and what our capacity is to address those different topics over the coming year. So again, we will be following up with the written workshop report that will include also just some of the comments made here today. And then we will be following up with a written survey to continue to solicit feedback from you all on the values that we gained from the workshop, ways that we could improve upon that sort of kind of gathering, and your all's thoughts on activities for the coming year. And so I think with that, then if there aren't any other questions, which I'm not seeing any other hands raised unless you see something I don't see last, then why don't we transition over to Nina, and she's going to say a few words about this broader Rocky Mountain Partner Forum and how and what the vision is for these partner forums and how they can contribute to the Great Northern LCC, and talk a bit about what that could look like, where this project could be potentially one project among multiple projects that the Rocky Mountain Partner Forum might ultimately try and tackle. So Nina, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it over to you, which will hopefully work. And so you should be able to share your screen. And I don't know if you're talking yet, Nina, but I'm not hearing you if you are, so you might need to unmute yourself.
Yeah,
Good.
Thank you, Molly. I'm here. Can everyone see the screen? Are we up?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, thanks. What I'd like to do now is talk more about the Rocky Mountain Partner Forum as a whole and the next steps for that, in addition to the project that Molly just discussed. So I know that some people on the call have seen these slides already, but I wanted to go a little bit as a review for people who are new on the call as well. And I'm having trouble advancing my own PowerPoint. Huh. Okay. Interesting. I can't escape either. There we go. I don't know what took it to jar it there, but there we go. So as far as background, the partner forums are intended to be this engagement of GNLCC conservation practitioners from the ground in these ecological partnerships that share conservation challenges in this general geographic context with shared issues and conservation needs and priorities. This schematic just gives you an idea about how the partner forums fit into the rest of the Great Northern LCC. We're missing one of them. The Cascadia group also is a partner forum that's on the the edge of the Great Northern and the Pacific LCC. And you can see here that the partner forums interact directly with the science staff and coordinators, and are also with the science community. A lot of people are part of the science community, and that there's also a connection to the advisory team and steering committee, as I'll talk about later. So the idea about the governance of these partner forums is that they're self-governed, that each forum decides how they want to be governed, how they want to be structured. They themselves identify the appropriate scale and formality. They reflect the needs of the participants, and that the Great Northern LCC will provide support and guidance to keep the forums going. The role and purpose of the partner forums are about delivering and coordinating science and information. So it's a way for the groups within that region to work together and share information, as well as make recommendations to the steering committee, to the staff of the Great Northern on specific science, information, tools, or products that are needed that the Great Northern Landscape Conservation Cooperative can facilitate. They also help advise and develop annual work plans for the LCC, and they provide feedback on how to get information back to user groups on the ground and effective ways to network. Evaluation and effectiveness. This is something that the LCC is definitely working on with the science plan, with the strategic conservation framework. These foundation documents are to set up a way to evaluate the effectiveness of how the LCC functions. And the partner forum is really critical to provide this feedback about how the work of the LCC gets applied on the ground and how we're making progress toward our shared outcomes. So just a little bit about process. Here's how the partner forums engage. Through interactive webinars like this, face-to-face meetings, discussion and information sharing, maybe also on webinars or other ways. There's a website that has a page for the partner forums, so we can share information that way and chat. Identifying flagship priorities, the body of knowledge, information, science, and capacity within the region, and again, this on-the-ground conservation delivery of programs, which includes adaptive management and measurable outcomes. So the leadership team is what we've been calling just this kind of smaller group of people who've been really interested and engaged in the partner forum. It's just kind of a shorthand. It doesn't mean that there's limited membership or anything like that. We just recognize that each of these partners within the Rocky Mountain region have a lot of members and that you can go really deep. And so we've just been calling this group of people who've been involved more like the leadership team. And so these people are science and conservation experts and leaders. They've been active in presenting information through webinars to outline issues. They've been active in coordinating and providing information into science and monitoring and evaluation. And this is also where the people who've been active in this leadership team for the partner forums are often part of the advisory team. Even some people are on the steering committee. There's leaders from the different landscape partnerships, and then there's people from universities and the rest of the science community and managers. So I wanted to just catch you up on what activities the partner forum has done so far. And you can see here from the timeline that we've met about 2 to 3 times a year since we've gotten going. We've had a number of meetings and webinars, and the June workshop that was face-to-face. So that's where we are. That's what we've done so far. I also wanted to just touch base. You know, we've reached out to people in the partner forums and those organizations in a number of different times. I think we've reached out at least once per year. Initially, during the framework development, we asked about how they wanted to see the partner forum evolve. And so this identified some of the opportunities and benefits for things like goal alignment and working toward a shared vision. We identified some issues, and I'll get to more of that in depth as well. we asked about the kind of tangible outcomes people wanted, things like networking and relationships and integrated monitoring, adaptive management, really working together on specific issues. And then the format, people said, you know, we really like that face-to-face meetings and webinar, you know, best. Field trips would be great. Anything that really solidifies this group as a way to work together. To go deeper on the priorities, these are the kinds of things we heard from people as we were putting together the strategic conservation framework. And all of these priorities made it into the framework as well. It's a compilation of what we heard from all the partner forums in the field. So this is where the landscape processes, the ecosystems, the species, and the cultural values were identified. So then last year we also took a quick survey just to take a pulse of, after we had this conservation framework out, you know, are we on track? And what we heard there was that, you know, the framework is mostly on track, but what we'd like to do is look at this gap analysis. I heard some of that this morning as well. What do we really need to do to identify what's missing, and how do we improve conservation on the ground? Also toward that end is identifying more specific objectives and identifying sort of good examples of what success would look like as we move forward. This is a better way that we could monitor and evaluate our progress. So we were thinking recently about, well, what are some of the benefits for people to participate in the Rocky Mountain Forum? We're very conscious about all the different groups and all the demands on your time. So what is it that would really make this worthwhile to engage in? And here are some of the things that we really wanted to make explicit and hope that this is something that will encourage participation as well. First of all, there's the Great Northern LCC annual funding call. And the priorities for that stem directly from the conservation framework, which all the partner forums had input in, but we understand that that's going to be adjusted and that each year there may be a specific focus. And the partner forums will have an opportunity to express those priorities and to be able to influence what those are for the funding call. Also, people have been represented on the review committee. Every year there's a committee formed to review all the proposals for funding, and that's definitely an area where partner forum people can participate in that. And there's, starting last year, there was a certain amount of funding that was put aside specifically for partner forum activities. So this is another way that groups within the partner forums can identify projects that they want to lead and submit proposals, just as Molly and Gary and Laura did. And then also right now, the science plan is getting going. And so I know Sean is going to be reaching out to all the partner forums to get their input on this, and participation in that science plan will again further make explicit those priorities and the ways, the things that the Great Northern really looks at as it goes forward with supporting on-the-ground conservation work through science at the landscape scale. And then this also, the connection, really strengthening the connection of the partner forums to the advisory team and the steering committee. I think I want to pause here and see if Tom or Yvette, if either of you have anything you'd like to add at this point. Okay, I don't hear anything, so we'll go on. The next steps, here's where I'd like to have the rest of the conversation focus. Just as Molly mentioned, you know, we're looking for next steps for the project, whether we go deeper in cold water issues or jump to another topic. There's some next steps for the partner forum as well. There's been some interest expressed in developing a charter for the Rocky Mountain Forum that would just make more explicit what the role of the partner forum is, how it functions, how to become engaged, what it means to be engaged, and kind of the scope of what it does. So I'd like to hear from folks if you're interested in something like that. Other ideas are to maintain this kind of connection with regular webinars as a series, maybe a state of the knowledge on different priority topics. And this would mean people from different organizations within the partner forum volunteering to give presentations or lead discussions, and to really set up a, I don't know, every month, every 2 months, whatever works for you guys, a way to keep that interaction going, discussion on these topics. And then also another idea has come up about mapping priority areas, and this could be part of the science plan discussion, or it could be a separate exercise in itself. You know, some of the comments earlier on this call talked about refugium and identifying connectivity for both aquatic and terrestrial areas. So that might be a way to do that as well. So that's what we're thinking, and we'd love to hear some feedback from you on where you'd like to see the partner forum go and how you would like to be involved.
Before we go to questions, Nina, I think that Yvette actually can and will talk now.
Oh, good.
Sorry about that. I had myself muted on this end. But thanks, Nina, and I think you covered this well. I think a lot of people have heard some of this before. It's some of the information we've been providing from the beginning, but Nina's doing a great job of being tracking and being our sort of communication person for the Rocky Mountain Forum and helping to keep people linked up. A couple things. Last year we didn't quite set aside money for the forums, but we talked about that. This year we'll be talking about that again, and it certainly would help if we got a clear message from the forum, which at this point is you folks and other people that are interested but couldn't make it today, saying, yes, we have some priority things we want to see funded, and then we can take that to our steering committee. It's starting to, each forum is sort of developing a little bit differently, which is good because they should reflect the needs of the partners, and some are becoming more formal than others. And it's certainly taken us a few years to kind of get things rolling. Everybody's busy, has lots of stuff going on. But as Nina referred to the science plan, what that really is sort of our final foundational document that will lay out how we connect our strategic framework, which is just kind of all the overall vision, goals, and conservation targets, or those species, habitat, and process priorities, to what kind of science and information we fund and how that connects with our goals and making progress towards those. So it will be good to have your input on that, and like Nina said, Sean will be sending out information in the future to convene folks about that or get review individually or whatever. At any point, if you want to be involved, just let us know about that. And the other thing I wanted to just mention is that we can certainly go a couple directions as well. We can try to delve deeper into some of these aquatic issues, as some people have requested. And Tom Olive, who's my partner with the Park Service, but the co-coordinator of the LCC, has been really tracking some of the connectivity work that's going on in the Great Northern, and we can certainly go down the route of exploring more what's going on in terms of connectivity in uplands or sort of terrestrial or even terrestrial and aquatic connectivity projects, if that's another important next step. So just keep that in mind. Thanks, Nina.
Nina, do you want to go ahead to
questions? Do we have any comments or questions?
We do. We have Virginia Kelly. Virginia, I am unmuting you.
Hi, everybody. It's Virginia Kelly. I'm the coordinator for the Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee, and I am interested in maybe defining the structure of the partnership a little more, whether that's a formal charter or whatever that might look like, and ideally working with some others that might be interested in doing that as well. Another thing I'm really interested in is the networking that the forum can provide and learning about each other. So if there were regular webinars, maybe each time a different partnership or a different agency could talk a little bit about itself. So I'm interested in defining structure and in learning more about each other.
Great. Thanks, Virginia. Are there any volunteers right now to work with Virginia? Or if you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can always contact me or Virginia directly and let her know that you'd be interested in doing that, working with the structure a little bit more.
And I'm also, by that, sorry, Nina, this is Yvette. I just wanted to by structure, I'm assuming you're meaning sort of a formality of governance. Not, it doesn't have to be a formal governance, but some way that we interact, and whether it's a charter or some kind of write-up that says this is how we're working together. Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly. Yep.
Exactly. Yes.
And I'm also happy to organize webinars to help schedule that and to start solicit people who want to be able to present information, things like that. I'd be happy to do that. So if you're interested and either want to speak up now or shoot me an email about that, I'm happy to do that as well.
This is Molly. I have a question. Would the charter also lay out kind of the content of what the Rocky Mountain Partner Forum would focus on? And I say that because I'm also a little bit familiar with how the Cascadia Partner Forum sort of forums. I don't think they don't have a charter, but what they came up with is maybe it may just be a 1-page or maybe it's a 2-page, just articulation of kind of what people are signing up for if they want to join this, and it's a 1-year commitment to participate in a certain number of meetings and calls, and that the products that are expected at the end of that year include X, Y, and Z. My understanding is it kind of is shaped like that. Would you envision this Rocky Mountain Partner Forum charter covering that kind of expectations and expected products as well?
I think it could. Yeah, and Virginia, you can chime in here too. But what I've heard from people, so it can be whatever the group wants it to be, and so those are definitely things that are important. As far as identifying sort of a work plan or the kinds of topics that will be covered, that might be revisited so that those things can change over time too. Virginia, do you want to clarify some ideas?
I would say if I were to work on this, and I agree, I step forward, I would see myself in kind of more of a facilitative role that, throw something out there and people would give their ideas about what should be in a charter, and it would be an iterative process with everyone that's interested.
Great. Any other comments or questions?
Yvette, one.
Do you want to share it?
Hi, this is Yvette. Just one. I wanted to just comment that some benefits of having stuff written down is that, as a few people have suggested, we can identify sort of a pilot time frame, like a year or two, and sort of some different ways of meeting, webinar, or maybe 1 or 2 face-to-face. Where that's possible, or and sort of scope out the, at least the main areas of emphasis to start, and that'll at least give people some idea of what they're getting into if folks want to go that way. So that would be some benefit of doing it that way. Something they can take to their boss or build into their workload, so we're not inundating people. But it is pretty flexible, and we really only want to push this forward if it's something that's working and helping people to connect and network. And we do have some funds available to sort of build on the mutual capacity and science needs of the group, so that would be another benefit.
Okay, we have a question from Jennifer Miller.
Yep. Oh, hi. It's actually Ann Carlson, and I'm with Jennifer in her office, as we thought we would just be on this call together. So I just wanted to say that I think that the last 2 bullet points in particular really resonate with us, because we think that mapping priority areas within the Great Northern LCC could be of tremendous benefit to a wide range of partners, and then linking that back to coordination on connectivity projects that might be happening right now, or it might be in planning phases for the future in terms of connectivity between different parts of the landscape. And I think that could be really powerful, the use of the partnerships and the networking that Virginia was talking about.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Ann.
Okay, next, Mike Whitfield.
Well, just following up a little bit, looking back toward the idea of the charter, I think the last comments from Ann go to this, but I would suggest kind of where Molly was going, that the emphasis would be on goals and a time frame for achievement of goals rather than sort of governance. I would think the governance would be pretty loose, not a lot of structure there, but some clear sense of how we arrive at goals and set some time limited targets.
Great. Any other comments or questions? Okay.
Well,
All right.
So
well,
I think
yeah, go ahead, Nina.
Okay, I was just going to conclude the webinar for now and thank everybody for your participation. We really appreciate everything that you've contributed, and we're looking forward to continuing the discussion. So as Molly, I'll give you the wrap-up to talk about next steps. We'll get the notes out from this meeting as well, and we will definitely follow up about folks interested in working on the charter and other upcoming activities.
Hey, Nina, this is Yvette. Can I just add something real quickly?
Sure.
I just wanted to remind folks that aren't aware that we do have a Great Northern LCC Steering Committee meeting coming up October 9th and 10th. I know there are some other meetings scheduled that same day, but October 9th and 10th in Waterton, Alberta. Alberta is hosting the meeting co-hosted by Parks Canada and the province of Alberta. So we do have a few steering committee members on the call, but even if you're in your agency or organization, if you have an interest in attending and participating, just let me know or contact one of us and we'll get you the right information.
Yeah, and that might be, you know, I know there'll be time, I believe from the draft agenda that there'll be some time for a discussion at that steering committee meeting about the partner forums, both updating the steering committee on what the partner forums, you know, have done to date or are hoping to do, but also maybe some discussion about what we hope to gain from those.
Yeah, we usually give an update on the partner forums. There's also quite a bit of a chunk of time on the agenda for the steering committee to discuss some sort of where do we go from here and some proposed sort of but some pilot projects for sort of proof of concept of this new model or paradigm of how we're trying to operate through the GNLCC. And there's a bunch of other things on the agenda. The agenda's on our website. If you go to events, you can find information about it. And it usually is regional executives or regional directors or executive directors of NGOs or sort of you know, mid to higher level folks. But we often have a sort of a peanut gallery, so to speak, of people that are attending to kind of see what's up, you know, sort of keep tabs or even just are interested in knowing how things are working. And we always get about, you know, 2/3 of the people that we, and it's a sort of a moving target of people that we get. You know, some are always the same, some are changing, but it's usually a pretty good group of decision makers within the Great Northern area. So it's a good time to talk about some of these issues.
So yeah, then just to wrap up, this is Molly again, and I'll just say, as Nina indicated, we will be following up from this webinar with, again, a copy of the PowerPoint, a recording for those who want to watch it again or more likely missed it and might want to check it out for themselves, and some notes of what was discussed. And then we will also very soon be following up with a written workshop report and a survey to help us better sort out everyone's thoughts and preferences on topics that we might explore going forward. So with that, I'll thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Can always appreciate feedback, both on calls like this, but at any time, please give us a call, send us an email, let us know your thoughts on how this project can be helpful to the community here in this region. So thanks so much, and we'll be in touch over email and other ways soon. Thanks, everybody.